Good afternoon, it's John Heaton, and today I thought I'd have a look at some favourite bass players of mine. So I've always been interested in the bass. Let me point out from the start, I'm not a bass player. I play a bit of piano. My son plays the bass a bit, and I've always been interested in the bass. I've always looked out and listened to the bass parts on the songs that I've grown up with over the years and since. And so although I'm not qualified to teach you about the bass or tell you the technicalities like someone like Mike Pacelli, his superb channel where he teaches you how to play a song on the bass or the guitar. Superb. Recommend that channel, by the way, if you haven't seen it. But I'm just going to talk about, because for me, I listen to the bass lines and some players stick out just because they seem to be sort of developing their own style or giving me something a bit different from what most bass players do. So I was interested to read Bill Wyman's quote about bass playing, saying, "I'm not a busy bass player, not like Stanley Clarke. In fact, I think people like that should be guitarists," because he goes on to say he thinks the bass should have some balls at the bottom end and then leave space for things like the guitars to fill it in. And I thought that was quite an interesting quote, because when you listen to the Stones, maybe you don't enthuse about Bill's bass playing in particular, but it's always rock solid and it's always perfect for the song, and you don't really need histrionics on Stones songs in the same way that you probably don't need histrionics from Cliff Williams when he's playing bass on AC/DC records. So I think there's quite a few examples where a bass player within a band is just playing to the strengths of the song required and is not required to do anything flashy, a bit like on the drumming front when everyone talks about Keith Moon being the greatest, but then other drummers are less technically flash as Keith Moon or technically good, but they deliver what's needed for the song in question. So that was just a bit of an introduction. But as I say, I couldn't tell you when Paul switched from Hofner to Rickenbacker, although it was sometime in the mid-60s, I know that. But in terms of what guitar he's playing, I'm pretty much in the dark still. Some of the earlier bass lines I discovered were like the bass line in The Chain from Fleetwood Mac, that superb bass line from John McVie at the end. Also does a strong bass line on Go Your Own Way, and Mick Fleetwood said, "You're a monster, John," when he was listening to the playback of that, and they isolated the bass on the end of Go Your Own Way. Also, obviously the McCartney's bass line would come together was an early thing for me to discover. Interesting how McCartney said that when Beatles needed a bass player, when Stuart Sutcliffe died or decided to leave, none of them volunteered. And so Paul kind of got lumbered with the bass, but I don't think it was, he said it wasn't the top job, but then I think he made it his own, and his bass playing is just as good as George's guitar playing, in my opinion, and it's really made a stamp on the Beatles' output. So what do I go for, technical excellence or the feel of the bass line and how melodic it is? Probably more of the latter. I'm sure there are many bass players out there who are technically better than some of the ones I'm going to mention. But I've already caveated this video by saying I'm not a bass player, and I hope people will just recognise it and take this video in the spirit for which in which it's intended, and not react like someone when I was commenting on the Stones the other day, say, John, you're not even a Stones fan," and then went on about to say that I wasn't qualified to comment or whatever. Just get a bit tired of that kind of comment, because I have bought 20 Stones albums over the years, plus several Keith solo, plus at least 2 of Mick's solo, so I don't know how you qualify to be a fan of the Rolling Stones, but anyway. So I've picked 5 bassists who I really admire from my record collection. So as I say, it doesn't cover the whole palette by any means, but it's just a few of my favourite, and I've put them in alphabetical order because I couldn't bring myself to rank them. So the first one is Jack Bruce, the famous bass player and singer from Cream, who went solo in 1969 with this album, Songs for a Tailor, and then followed it up with Harmony Row in 71. Those are probably his most famous solo albums, and if you want to check out his bass playing, I would recommend Songs for a Tailor, the first album in particular, and also any of Cream's output is just wonderful, because it's just a 3-piece band, and Jack on the bass is often filling in for where the rhythm guitar might have been, and it's very interesting to hear that dynamic with three of them. So that was Jack Bruce. I saw him twice in the Grand in Clapham, which is right next to Clapham Junction Station, if you know it, if you live in London. And the tickets were not expensive, and we were pretty close to the front. And as I say, 2 consecutive nights, and then we managed to wangle our way into an after party at a Mexican restaurant a couple of doors down from the Grand. I'm not sure how we did that, but we met Jack in that after party. And I remember asking him about George Harrison's contribution to Songs for a Tailor, and he was very nice and polite. Anyway, I think Jack's bass playing is incredibly innovative, and he almost makes it the lead instrument whenever you hear him play, and it's really quite remarkable. The second one I'm going to choose, again, working through an alphabetical order, it's John Jack Burnell from the Stranglers. Sadly, 2 members of the Stranglers have left us recently, but Jean-Jacques Burnel and Hugh Cornwall still with us. Hugh Cornwall, the singer here, and Jean-Jacques Burnel, who also sings a bit, but his main contribution to the Stranglers is the bass. And I think this is probably the album I would direct you to if you want to check out some of his bass playing. Black and White, this album's called, from 1978, and the track in particular, where I think his bass playing is out of this world, is Nice and Sleazy. Although, you know, Toiler on the Sea and All Quiet on the Eastern Front, any of the songs from this album, and also I'd recommend this album, The Raven. In fact, you couldn't really go wrong with any Stranglers albums, but I just picked those 2 as examples if you want to discover the Stranglers' work and Jean-Jacques Burnel's bass playing. And again, similar to Jack Bruce, he makes the bass the lead instrument, and it's quite remarkable. And yeah, pretty unique in that respect. Certainly amongst the late 70s, early 80s bands at the time, I can't think of a bass player who stood out quite so much, although the next one on my list is up there, and it's The Cure's bass player Simon Gallup. And unfortunately, it's not easy to find a picture of either Jean-Jacques Burnel or Simon Gallup, because they weren't very good at putting their pictures on the sleeves. But he's been the bass player more or less all the time since they started. That 17 Seconds is their first album, which I would direct you to if you want to check out some of his bass playing. And this is Disintegration from 1989, which is a double album on vinyl, but when it came out it was a single CD. And I don't know, tracks like A Forest, I remember at the time in 1980 hearing on the radio and thinking, what is this bass line? This is superb. And that was one of the earlier Cure songs. And then Disintegration has songs like Fascination Street, which are just wonderful. And I saw the Cure in concert with my son Richie in Budapest 6 years ago now. Brilliant, brilliant show. Number 4 on my list, well, not number 4, alphabetically, working our way through the alphabet, we reached Tony Levin, who played on this album from Paul Simon and also played on Double Fantasy from John Lennon. And this is my copy signed by Tony Levin and Earl Slick here, and this also, Paul Simon's album signed by Tony. Not easy to find a picture of Tony on one of the records, but here's the Lennon band from 1980, and he's the bald gentleman with the moustache in the front row next to Earl Slick. That's Tony Levin. And I met him in Liverpool in August. Very nice guy. We had a bit of a chat. And I just think he's a brilliant bass player. And I have to admit, the first time I became aware of him was on Double Fantasy. And I just loved his little bass runs and his sensitive bass playing on a song like Beautiful Boy, beautifully observed. And then later on, when Nobody Told Me came out on Milk and Honey, I just loved the running bass line and with the little up note at the end of the bridge there. And I just think it's a very tasteful bass player. He's made the Chapman stick very famous over the years, with going on tour with a band he calls the Stickmen, I think. And I've never seen one of those concerts, but I did get to see him in Liverpool play with the Double Fantasy band, or with 3 members of the Double Fantasy band: Earl Slick, Tony Levin, Andy Newmark, and we had Mark McGann on vocals singing the Lennon vocals, and it was just a stunning show. So that was Tony Levin, and I think his bass playing on One Trick Pony is also worth checking out, and still crazy after all those years. He's doing the drumming on that. A track like Late in the Evening is built around the bass line. If I had had more time with him in Liverpool, I would have asked him, did you have a hand in coming up with that central hook of the song, or did Paul Simon think of that? God Bless the Absentee has that wonderful bass line in it, the way he goes up on the scale and comes down. I just love it. Okay, so that was Tony Levin. And number 5 on the list, or alphabetically speaking still, and we're going to go with McCartney. And I want to point you towards Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper from the Beatles output, in particular for his bass playing. But you could really pick anything. The White Album, Dear Prudence is wonderful. But on just thinking of Abbey Road, I mean, the Come Together has a brilliant bass line. Something has an all-time great bass line. Maxwell has a very interesting bass line, although the jury is out whether Paul plays that or George Harrison. But anyway, all the way through Abbey Road, wonderful bass playing, wonderful musicianship from all 4. And all throughout his solo career, particularly in the 70s, he's playing really good bass, and Wings at the Speed of Sound is a good example of that. If you check out a song called Silly Love Songs, even if you don't like the song, you find it a bit commercial, I'm sure you'll appreciate the bass line. So other bassists I've admired over the years, Dougie Thompson from Supertramp, Tim Drummond, who did a lot of bass playing for Neil Young and Bob Dylan, Donald Duck Dunn, guested on quite a few Clapton albums that I own, Robbie Shakespeare, who played with Sly Dunbar, he's on a couple of Dylan albums that I own, John McVie, the bass player from Fleetwood Mac, Willie Weeks, who played with George Harrison among others, Bill Wyman, as I mentioned, from the Stones, we've got John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin, John Entwistle from The Who. They always feature high up on these all-time great bass player lists, but because The Who is not particularly close to my heart, maybe I just haven't discovered his bass playing, but I have nothing but respect for him. Tina Weymouth, perfect bass player for Talking Heads as well, and not to forget Klaus Voormann on some of the solo Beatles records, and Manfred Mann before that. And a gentleman called Carl Radel from Derek and the Dominoes, who also played with Clapton until he died in late 70s. So this was 5 of my favourite bass players. A couple of examples on the right-hand side of which albums to check out if you're struggling or if you'd like an introduction. And then those 5 individuals don't need too much introduction, but for the middle 2 I've put the name of the band they were in, just in case you were not aware or you'd forgot to note it down when I was talking earlier. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.